The sun was beginning its slow descent, casting long shadows across the jagged red rocks of the Utah desert. My cousin Rachel and I had decided to visit our grandparents' old ranch, a desolate property surrounded by miles of wilderness and open skies. It had been years since either of us had set foot there, but we thought it might be a fun, nostalgic road trip. Rachel, ever the skeptic, dismissed the stories our grandparents used to tell us about strange sightings and unexplainable events around the ranch. I wasn't as sure. Something about those tales had always stuck with me. The drive out was uneventful, save for the occasional rabbit darting across the dirt road. By the time we arrived, the sky had turned a fiery orange. The ranch looked as if it had been frozen in time. The main house was weathered but still standing, its paint peeling and windows clouded with dust. Beyond it was the barn, its roof sagging slightly, and the windmill that creaked faintly with every gust. "This place is a dump," Rachel muttered, stepping out of the car and stretching. "How did they even live here?" I shrugged, brushing off her cynicism. "It's just old. Come on, let's check it out." As we explored the house, memories of summers spent there flooded back. The faded floral wallpaper, the squeaky floorboards, the smell of aged wood. It was all so familiar, yet there was an uneasiness I couldn't shake. It was as if the air itself was heavier, pressing down on my chest. Night fell quickly in the desert, and with it came a silence so profound it was almost oppressive. We decided to build a fire outside and reminisce under the stars. The vastness of the sky was breathtaking, but the darkness beyond the fire's glow felt impenetrable. "Do you remember those stories Grandpa used to tell us?" I asked, poking the fire with a stick. Rachel rolled her eyes. "You mean the ones about skinwalkers? Please, those were just tales to scare us into behaving. There's no such thing." Before I could respond, a faint sound broke the stillness. It was a low, guttural growl, almost like an animal, but not quite. We both froze, straining to hear. "Probably a coyote," Rachel said, though her voice lacked its usual confidence. I nodded, trying to convince myself she was right. But deep down, I knew better. Coyotes didn't sound like that. We decided to call it a night and headed back into the house. Rachel took the couch in the living room while I claimed the small bedroom we used to share as kids. Despite the warmth of my sleeping bag, I couldn't shake the chill that seemed to seep through the walls. Sleep came fitfully, and when it did, it was filled with strange, disjointed dreams. I woke suddenly to the sound of footsteps outside my window. My heart raced as I sat up, listening intently. The footsteps were slow and deliberate, crunching on the gravel path. I reached for the flashlight I'd brought and crept to the window. The beam of light cut through the darkness, but there was nothing there. "Rachel," I whispered, but there was no response. Summoning what little courage I had, I stepped outside. The cold night air bit at my skin as I scanned the area. The footsteps had stopped, but the silence was worse. It was the kind of silence that made your ears ring, as if the world itself was holding its breath. Then I saw it, a figure standing at the edge of the firelight. It was tall and hunched, its limbs unnaturally long. At first glance, it looked like a man, but as my eyes adjusted, I realized something was terribly wrong. Its head was too large, its features distorted, and those eyes, glowing faintly like embers, bored into me with an intensity that made my blood run cold. I stumbled back, my flashlight trembling in my hand. The figure tilted its head, mimicking the movement like a predator sizing up its prey. Then it let out a sound, a mix between a howl and a scream that sent a shiver down my spine. Before I could react, it darted into the darkness, moving with an unnatural speed. I bolted back inside, locking the door behind me. Rachel was sitting up on the couch, her face pale. "Did you see it?" I gasped. She nodded, her hands trembling. "What the hell was that?" "I don't know," I admitted, my voice barely above a whisper. "But we need to leave, now." We hurriedly gathered our things, too frightened to speak. As we stepped outside, the wind picked up, carrying with it a low, almost human-like laughter. The figure was nowhere in sight, but the feeling of being watched was overwhelming. The drive back to the nearest town was a blur. Neither of us spoke, the weight of what we had seen pressing down on us like a heavy fog. When we finally reached safety, we reported the incident to the local authorities, but they dismissed it as a wild animal sighting. Rachel and I knew better. What we had encountered wasn't an animal, it wasn't human either. It was something ancient, something malevolent. A skinwalker. To this day, I can still feel its eyes on me, watching from the shadows. And sometimes, when the wind howls just right, I swear I can hear that laughter again, echoing through the darkness. It was a trip we had planned for months. My friend Miguel and I loved hiking and decided to explore the rugged terrain of the Navajo Nation Reservation in northern Arizona. Miguel's family had some roots in the area, and he was eager to reconnect with the land. I had heard about the beauty of the high desert, the towering cliffs, and the endless star-filled nights. What I hadn't expected were the stories, the warnings whispered about skinwalkers. Miguel's grandmother had mentioned it the night before we left, her voice low and serious. "Do not wander too far from your camp," she said, her eyes dark with worry. "And if you hear something, anything strange, do not follow it. The skinwalkers will try to trick you." I laughed it off at the time, thinking it was just a bit of superstition to keep us safe in the wilderness. But Miguel didn't laugh. He nodded solemnly, and I could see the unease in his eyes. The first few days of the trip were uneventful. We hiked through breathtaking landscapes, the wind carrying the scent of sagebrush and the calls of distant birds. The land felt alive, humming with an energy I couldn't quite place. At night, we sat by the fire, sharing stories and marveling at the Milky Way stretching across the sky. It was on the fourth night that things began to change. We had set up camp in a small canyon surrounded by jagged rock formations. The firelight flickered against the stones, casting long, shifting shadows. As Miguel cooked dinner, I wandered a bit further from the campsite to take some photos. That's when I heard it. A voice calling my name. It was faint at first, carried on the breeze. "Daniel!" I froze, my camera hanging from its strap around my neck. The voice sounded like Miguel's, but he was back at camp. Confused, I called out, "Miguel?" No response. "Daniel?" The voice came again, closer this time and just slightly off. A chill ran down my spine. Something about the tone was wrong. As if it were trying too hard to mimic Miguel's voice, but failing to capture the human warmth behind it. I turned back toward the camp, my steps quickening. When I returned, Miguel was still by the fire, stirring a pot of stew. He looked up, his face lit with relief. "Where were you?" "I was calling for you." I hesitated, my mouth dry. You called my name?" Miguel shook his head. "No, I didn't leave the fire." The unease settled deep in my gut. I didn't tell him what I had heard. Instead, I sat by the fire, trying to shake off the feeling of being watched. That night, as we lay in our tents, the wind picked up, howling through the canyon. I couldn't sleep. The air felt heavy, oppressive, and the strange sensation of being observed persisted. Just as I was beginning to drift off, I heard it again, my name, spoken in that same uncanny tone. This time, it was followed by the sound of footsteps circling our tents. "Miguel," I whispered, shaking his shoulder. "Do you hear that?" He groggily sat up, listening. The footsteps stopped, replaced by a low growl that made my blood run cold. Grabbing his flashlight, Miguel unzipped the tent and shone the light outside. The beam cut through the darkness, revealing nothing but empty desert. But the growling continued, echoing off the canyon walls. Then we saw it. A figure stood at the edge of the firelight, its form twisted and hunched. It resembled a coyote, but its limbs were too long, its eyes too intelligent. It stared at us, unblinking, as if daring us to move. Miguel's hand trembled as he held the flashlight. "Don't make a sound," he whispered. The creature began to move, its gait unnatural, as if it didn't fully understand how to use its limbs. It circled the campsite, its eyes never leaving us. Suddenly, it let out a piercing scream, a sound that was neither human nor animal. My instincts screamed at me to run, but Miguel grabbed my arm, shaking his head. "Stay still," he whispered. "It feeds on fear." The creature eventually disappeared into the shadows, but neither of us slept that night. The next morning, we packed up and left, our nerves frayed. But the experience stayed with me, haunting my dreams and creeping into the edges of my waking thoughts. I couldn't forget the way it had moved, the way it had called my name. Even now, as I write this, I can feel its presence, lingering just beyond the light. The skinwalker is out there, waiting, watching. The road stretched endlessly ahead, a ribbon of cracked asphalt winding through the barren desert. I was driving cross-country to a new job in California, eager to leave behind the small town monotony of my old life. My car, a beat-up sedan that had seen better days, hummed along steadily, though the occasional rattle reminded me of its age. Somewhere along the Arizona-New Mexico border, I decided to take a detour. The main highway was crowded with semi-trucks, and the idea of a quieter, more scenic route appealed to me. According to the map, a side road would lead me through Whispering Canyon, a place I'd never heard of, but sounded intriguing. As I turned off the highway, the scenery shifted. The desert grew wilder, with jagged rock formations and sparse vegetation. The sun dipped lower, painting the horizon in fiery hues of orange and red. It was beautiful, yet there was something about the canyon that felt heavy. The air seemed denser, the silence more profound. The first sign of trouble came as twilight fell. My car's engine sputtered, coughed, and then died altogether. I managed to steer it to the side of the narrow road before it rolled to a stop. "Seriously?" I muttered, stepping out and popping the hood. I wasn't much of a mechanic, but even I could tell the engine was overheated. There was no cell service, of course, and the nearest town was at least 50 miles back. As I stared at the engine in frustration, a sound broke the oppressive silence. It was faint at first, like the whisper of wind through the canyon. But it grew louder, more distinct, voices, soft and urgent, as if carried on the breeze. I turned, scanning the surrounding cliffs. There was no one in sight, just the looming rocks and the fading light. "Hello?" I called out, my voice echoing off the canyon walls. No answer. The whispers stopped abruptly, leaving an unnerving stillness in their wake. Deciding it was best to stay with the car, I grabbed a flashlight and some water from the trunk. Night fell quickly in the desert, and soon the only light came from my flashlight and the faint glow of the moon. That's when I saw it, a figure standing on a nearby ridge. It was tall and thin, its silhouette stark against the darkening sky. For a moment I thought it might be a hiker, but something about its posture was wrong. It stood unnaturally still, as if it were waiting, watching. I called out again, but the figure didn't move. A chill crept over me, despite the desert heat. Suddenly the whispers returned, louder this time. They seemed to come from all around me, echoing off the rocks. I couldn't make out the words, but their tone was urgent, almost frantic. Then the figure on the ridge moved. It descended the slope with an unnatural grace, its limbs bending in ways that made my stomach churn. As it approached, I could see more details, or rather, the lack of them. Its face was featureless, a smooth expanse of pale skin that seemed to shimmer in the moonlight. Panic surged through me and I stumbled back toward the car. The whispers grew deafening, a cacophony of voices that seemed to be inside my head. I scrambled into the driver's seat and slammed the door, locking it behind me. The figure reached the road and began circling the car, its movements deliberate and predatory. My hands trembled as I gripped the flashlight, shining it through the windshield. The beam illuminated the figure for just a moment, and what I saw made my blood run cold. Its limbs were too long, its joints bending at odd angles. Its skin seemed to ripple, as if something beneath it was trying to break free. The whispers stopped suddenly, replaced by a single, guttural voice that seemed to come from everywhere and nowhere. "Leave this place." I fumbled with the keys, praying the car would start. Miraculously, the engine roared to life. Without hesitation, I floored the gas pedal, the tires kicking up dust as I sped down the road. The figure didn't follow, but I didn't look back to check. The whispers faded as I left the canyon, replaced by the steady hum of the engine. When I finally reached a gas station miles away, the attendant gave me a strange look as I recounted what had happened. "You're lucky," he said, his voice low. "Not everyone who enters Whispering Canyon comes back." I didn't ask for details, I just wanted to put as much distance as possible between me and that place. Even now, the memory haunts me. Sometimes, when I'm alone at night, I swear I can still hear the whispers, faint and insistent, as if they're calling me back. It was supposed to be a straightforward assignment. I worked as a freelance journalist, specializing in human interest stories, and my latest project involved exploring Native American legends and folklore. My editor was excited about the pitch. It promised to be unique, raw, and evocative. I'd arranged to visit a remote Navajo reservation in Arizona. The elders had agreed to share their stories about the Skinwalker, a malevolent shapeshifter from their culture. I had read enough to know that it was a deeply feared entity, but I dismissed it as mere superstition. After all, legends often grew from real experiences, but they were just stories, right? When I arrived, the sun was beginning to set. The small cluster of homes was surrounded by endless stretches of desert, framed by jagged mesas in the distance. An older man named Tom greeted me. His weathered face and solemn demeanor hinted at the weight of the tales he carried. "You're here for the stories," he said, as he led me to his modest home. "Yes," I replied. "I want to understand the culture and the folklore. People need to hear these stories." Tom's eyes narrowed slightly, but he nodded. "You'll get your stories, but you'll also need to respect what you don't understand." That night, Tom gathered a few other elders, and they began recounting tales of the Skinwalker. Their voices were low, filled with a mix of reverence and fear. They spoke of shamans who turned to dark magic, transforming into animals to harm others. They described encounters where people heard whispers in the desert, saw shadows that moved unnaturally, or smelled rotting flesh with no source. Skinwalkers feed on fear, one elder said, his voice trembling. And they never forget who enters their land. The intensity in their eyes unsettled me, but I chalked it up to their belief in the legend. After the meeting, Tom offered to let me sleep in his guest room. That night, as I lay in bed, the reservation felt oppressively quiet. The usual sounds of the desert, coyotes howling, insects chirping, were absent. I tossed and turned, unable to shake the sense that something was off. Around midnight, I heard it. A faint, scratching sound like claws against wood came from the window. My heart pounded as I sat up, straining to listen. The sound grew louder, more insistent. I forced myself to peek through the curtains, expecting to see a stray dog or some other animal. Instead, I saw a figure standing several yards away, partially obscured by the shadows. It was tall and thin, with glowing yellow eyes that pierced the darkness. I froze, unable to look away. The figure tilted its head as if studying me, then crouched on all fours. In an instant, it darted off into the desert with an unnatural speed. My breath came in ragged gasps as I stumbled back from the window. The scratching stopped, but the air in the room felt heavy, suffocating. I wanted to convince myself it was a trick of the light, but deep down, I knew better. The next morning, I told Tom what I had seen. He didn't seem surprised. "They know you're here now," he said grimly. "You've got to leave." I wanted to argue, to say I hadn't finished my story, but the fear in his eyes silenced me. I packed my things and prepared to leave, but before I could, a young woman from the reservation approached me. Her name was Lena, and she seemed hesitant to speak. "You saw it, didn't you?" she asked. I nodded. "I saw one too when I was a child," she said, her voice barely above a whisper. "It followed me for years. Sometimes it still does." Her words sent a chill down my spine, but I didn't have time to dwell on them. I got in my car and began the long drive back to civilization. The journey was uneventful at first, but as dusk approached, I noticed something in my rearview mirror. A figure was running behind my car. It was far away at first, but it moved with alarming speed, closing the distance in seconds. I floored the gas pedal, my heart racing. The figure kept pace with me, its grotesque form illuminated by my taillights. It let out a guttural scream that shook me to my core. Suddenly it veered off the road and disappeared into the desert. I didn't stop until I reached a motel hours later, collapsing onto the bed in exhaustion. Even now I can't explain what I saw. The legends I had dismissed as mere stories became terrifyingly real. And sometimes, late at night, I still hear that guttural scream echoing in my mind. The sun was setting as I drove along the barren stretch of highway that cut through the high desert. I was en route to a photography project, documenting remote landscapes for a travel magazine. My destination was a secluded campsite near Monument Valley, known for its unspoiled natural beauty. The sky turned shades of orange and red, painting a breathtaking scene. But as the light faded, so did my sense of calm. The vast openness of the desert felt less inviting and more isolating. I glanced at the GPS, which was still guiding me down this desolate road. After hours of driving, my gas gauge dipped alarmingly close to empty. Relief washed over me when a weathered sign for a gas station appeared on the horizon. "Pit stop, open 24 hours, it read. The station sat alone in the desert, its single flickering light barely visible against the darkening sky. As I pulled in, I noticed a few rusted vehicles parked nearby. The place looked abandoned, but the faint hum of fluorescent lights inside suggested otherwise. A man stepped out from behind the counter when I entered. He was tall and wiry, with a face deeply lined by years of sun exposure. His name tag read Earl. "Fill her up?" he asked, his voice gravelly. "Yeah, please," I replied, handing him my card. As Earl rang up the transaction, I caught sight of a bulletin board covered in faded missing person flyers. There were at least a dozen, their smiling faces staring back at me with a haunting permanence. "They don't look for them out here," Earl said suddenly, following my gaze. "Too much land, too many places to disappear." I forced a smile, uneasy with his choice of words. After the tank was full, I bought some snacks and headed back to the car. As I got in, a chill ran down my spine. A figure stood in the distance, barely visible in the faint light of the station. It seemed to be watching me, but before I could get a better look, it turned and walked into the darkness. I drove away quickly, brushing off the encounter as my imagination. But as the road stretched on, I couldn't shake the feeling that I was being followed. My rearview mirror reflected only the empty highway behind me, yet the sensation lingered. Hours later, I reached the campsite. It was eerily quiet, the kind of silence that felt unnatural. I set up my tent and tried to focus on the project ahead. The first night passed without incident, though I woke several times to faint noises outside the tent. Scratches on the ground, distant footsteps, nothing loud enough to alarm me, but enough to keep me on edge. On the second night, the noises grew louder. Something was circling my tent. I held my breath, clutching a flashlight as shadows moved across the fabric. Summoning my courage, I unzipped the tent and shone the beam outside. There was nothing there. I stepped out cautiously, scanning the area. The moon illuminated the desert, casting long, strange shadows across the sand. That's when I saw it, a shape crouched on a nearby rock. It wasn't human, though it vaguely resembled one. Its limbs were too long, its posture unnaturally bent. Its eyes glowed faintly, reflecting the light from my flashlight. My legs froze as the creature slowly turned its head toward me. A guttural sound, low and menacing, broke the silence. I stumbled backward, dropping the flashlight. By the time I managed to pick it up, the figure had vanished. I didn't sleep that night. The next morning, I packed up and decided to leave early. The drive back was a blur, my paranoia growing with every mile. The vastness of the desert felt oppressive, each shadow a potential threat. As the sun set on my return trip, the car's engine sputtered. The gas station from before wasn't far, and I hoped Earl might still be there. When I arrived, the place was dark. I called out, but no one answered. The bulletin board of missing person flyers seemed fuller than before. I decided to wait in the car until morning, locking the doors and keeping the engine running. Around midnight, the headlights illuminated movement in the distance. Shapes darted across the desert, too fast and too fluid to be human. One of them approached the car, its form becoming clearer. It was the same creature I had seen at the campsite, its glowing eyes locked onto mine. It reached for the window, its fingers unnaturally long and clawed. My instincts took over. I floored the gas pedal, ignoring the engine's protests. The figure chased me for miles, its movements unnervingly smooth. It finally stopped as I crossed a bridge, standing still in the rearview mirror as I sped away. When I reached civilization, I reported the encounter to local authorities. They listened politely but offered no help. "You're not the first to talk about something out there," one officer admitted, "but no one ever has proof." To this day, I can't explain what I saw. The desert holds secrets we aren't meant to uncover, and whatever followed me that night is a reminder of the unknown that lurks in the shadows. I was never one for long road trips, but my sister's wedding was non-negotiable. The invitation arrived with an air of finality, and so I found myself driving through the barren landscapes of the southwest, headed toward her small town ceremony. The drive was monotonous, endless stretches of sand, sparse vegetation, and the occasional tumbleweed rolling across the highway. The GPS routed me down a desolate back road, shaving off 2 hours from the trip. I welcomed the shortcut, eager to end the journey. As the sun dipped below the horizon, a fiery orange painted the sky, but the beauty was fleeting. Darkness crept in, consuming the landscape. My headlights pierced the inky black, illuminating only the road ahead. That's when I saw it. A figure stood at the edge of the road, shrouded in shadows. It was motionless, almost blending into the desert. As I neared, the form took shape, a man draped in a tattered coat, his face obscured by a wide-brimmed hat. I slowed down instinctively, but as the car passed, my stomach twisted. His head turned to follow me, and though his face was in shadow, I felt his eyes lock onto mine. Shaking off the unease, I pressed on. After all, hitchhikers weren't uncommon in these parts, and I convinced myself he was just a stranded traveler. An hour later, the road narrowed, and my gas gauge blinked ominously. The next town was still miles away, and the thought of running out of fuel in the middle of nowhere made my pulse quicken. Relief washed over me when a neon sign flickered in the distance. Desert Stop Gas and Diner. It was the only structure for miles, a weathered building with a peeling facade. I pulled in, and the place was eerily quiet. The gas pump looked ancient, its paint chipped and nozzle cracked. Inside the diner, a lone waitress leaned against the counter, idly flipping through a magazine. Her name tag read Nancy. She barely glanced at me as I walked in. "Pump's prepaid," she said flatly. I paid for the gas and ordered a coffee to go. While waiting, I noticed a bulletin board near the counter, cluttered with faded notices. Missing pets, help wanted ads, and, most unsettlingly, missing person flyers. Something about those flyers gnawed at me. One of the photos, a young woman with striking green eyes, seemed oddly familiar, though I couldn't place why. "Busy road?" I asked Nancy, trying to mask my unease. She snorted. "Not much traffic out here. Folks come and go, mostly go." Her words lingered as I left the diner, fueling up as quickly as possible. The desert wind howled, carrying with it an unnatural chill. Back on the road, the feeling of being watched returned. Every shadow seemed alive, every gust of wind carried whispers. The headlights illuminated a stretch of road ahead, and my heart stopped. The man from earlier stood in the middle of the highway, unmoving. His hat obscured his face, but his stance was unmistakable. I slammed on the brakes, skidding to a halt. When I looked up, he was gone. The rest of the drive was a blur of paranoia and exhaustion. I reached the small motel where I was staying, checked in, and locked the door behind me. Sleep came fitfully, plagued by strange dreams. Shadows moved in the corners of my vision, and whispers filled the air, speaking a language I couldn't understand. I awoke to a sound, a soft tapping at the window. My heart raced as I pulled back the curtain, revealing nothing but darkness. Then I saw them, footprints in the sand outside the window. They weren't human. The tracks were elongated with claw, like impressions at the tips. My mind raced, trying to rationalize what I was seeing, but the primal part of me screamed to run. The next day, I left the motel and continued to my sister's town, trying to put the night behind me, but the sense of unease followed. During the wedding reception, I overheard locals swapping stories. They spoke of creatures that roamed the desert at night, shapeshifters that could mimic human form. "Skinwalkers," one elderly man said gravely. "They take what you fear most and use it against you." I tried to dismiss it as folklore, but the memory of the figure on the road and the clawed footprints haunted me. As I drove back home, I couldn't shake the feeling that I was being watched. The whispers grew louder, the shadows darker. Even now, months later, I can't drive through open desert without looking over my shoulder. Something followed me that night, and I fear it's still waiting, lurking in the shadows, ready to pounce the moment I let my guard down. The desert nights were colder than I had anticipated, a biting chill that seeped into my bones as I drove along the isolated highway. I was heading to a remote campground, a promise made to my best friend, Lucas, who had convinced me this trip would be a perfect escape from city life. Lucas was an outdoorsman at heart, always drawn to nature's raw beauty. I was the opposite, a city dweller through and through, more comfortable with skyscrapers and crowded streets than endless sand and starlit skies. But his excitement was infectious, and so here I was, steering my beat up SUV into the vast unknown. The campground was nestled at the base of a rocky ridge. Lucas had gone ahead to set up camp, leaving me to follow after work. By the time I arrived, the moon hung high, casting an ethereal glow over the landscape. Lucas greeted me with his trademark grin, a campfire already crackling in the cool night air. We shared stories, laughed, and ate slightly charred hot dogs. For a moment, the world felt simple, as if we were the only two people on Earth. As the fire dwindled, Lucas brought up the ridge. "They say the Navajo called this place sacred," he said, poking the embers. "But there are stories, old ones, about things that roam these parts. Things you're not supposed to see." I rolled my eyes. "Let me guess, skinwalkers?" His face grew serious. "Yeah, it's not just a myth, though. My uncle swears he saw one out here once, said it looked like a coyote at first, but when it stood up..." I cut him off with a laugh. "Come on, man, you're not going to scare me with campfire tales." He didn't press the issue, but his unease lingered. I shrugged it off, chalking it up to the atmosphere. That night, sleep came slowly. The wind howled through the ridge, carrying an unsettling whistle that sounded almost human. The tent felt flimsy, a thin barrier against the unknown. Sometime past midnight, I awoke to a sound, a faint rustling outside. My heart raced as I strained to listen. It could have been the wind, I told myself, or maybe an animal scavenging for food. Then I heard it, a low growl, guttural and chilling. I shook Lucas awake. "There's something out there," I whispered. He grabbed a flashlight and unzipped the tent cautiously. The beam cut through the darkness, illuminating the barren landscape. Nothing. "Probably just a coyote," he said, though his voice lacked conviction. We tried to go back to sleep, but the unease lingered. The next morning, we found tracks around the campsite. They were too large for a coyote and oddly misshapen, as if made by something that wasn't meant to walk on four legs or two. Lucas suggested we hike up the ridge to clear our heads. The ascent was grueling, the rocky terrain unforgiving, but the view was breathtaking. From the top, the desert stretched endlessly, a sea of sand and stone. As we rested, Lucas pointed to a cave opening halfway down the ridge. That's where my uncle said he saw it. Curiosity got the better of us, and we decided to explore. The cave was narrow and dark, the air thick with an earthy scent. As we ventured deeper, the walls seemed to close in, and an overwhelming sense of dread settled over me. Lucas stopped suddenly, shining his flashlight on the ground. Bones, scattered and broken, some too large to belong to animals. "We shouldn't be here," I said, my voice barely above a whisper. A noise echoed from deeper within the cave, a shuffle followed by a low, guttural growl. We turned and ran, the flashlight bobbing wildly in Lucas's hand. The cave seemed endless, the exit further than I remembered. Just as we reached the mouth of the cave, I glanced back. A figure stood in the shadows, its shape shifting unnaturally. For a moment it looked like a man, then a coyote, then something unrecognizable. We didn't stop running until we reached the campsite. Grabbing only the essentials, we fled, leaving the tent and supplies behind. On the drive back, neither of us spoke. The silence was heavy, broken only by the hum of the engine. Lucas moved away a few months later, and we never discussed the trip again. But sometimes, late at night, I hear that whistle in the wind. And I wonder if something followed us back from the ridge, waiting for the right moment to make itself known, to make it. The plan was simple enough. Drive through the reservation lands in the southwest, camp for the night at a scenic spot Lucas had found online, and continue our road trip at sunrise. But the southwest is a place where the landscape itself feels alive, where ancient spirits seem to linger just out of sight, their whispers carried on the dry, desert winds. It was late afternoon when we reached the secluded trailhead. The air was thick with heat, the sun casting long shadows over the rocky terrain. Lucas parked the truck near a dry riverbed, and we loaded our packs for a short hike to the campsite he'd picked, a clearing near a canyon's edge with an unbroken view of the vast, red, stained desert. "I read about this place," Lucas said, shouldering his pack. "The Navajo believe it's sacred, but some say it's cursed. Skinwalker territory." I laughed, shaking my head. "You really need to stop reading those ghost forums, man." But as we made our way down the dusty trail, I couldn't shake the feeling that the land was watching us, that the mountains and valleys were more than just ancient rock formations. By the time we reached the campsite, the sun was sinking below the horizon, painting the sky in hues of blood orange and deep purple. We set up the tent and built a small fire. As the flames crackled and the desert chill settled in, Lucas started telling stories, local legends about skinwalkers, beings said to be Navajo witches capable of transforming into animals to inflict harm or chaos. "They're supposed to be able to mimic voices," he said, staring into the fire. "They lure people away, out into the wilderness, and then—" "And then what?" I asked, smirking. He shrugged. "They don't come back." We laughed it off, though unease prickled at the edges of my mind. As the night deepened, the wind picked up, howling through the canyon like a living thing. I lay in the tent, staring at the fabric above me, listening to the eerie symphony of the desert. Lucas was already snoring softly beside me, oblivious to the strange cries that punctuated the wind, high-pitched and inhuman. It was some time after midnight when I heard it. "Help!" The voice was faint but unmistakable, echoing from the canyon below. I sat bolt upright, my heart pounding. "Lucas!" I whispered, shaking him awake. "What?" he mumbled, rubbing his eyes. "Did you hear that?" We listened in silence, the only sound the rustling of the tent in the wind. Then there it was again. "Help me, please!" It sounded closer now, a woman's voice, strained and desperate. Lucas grabbed his flashlight and unzipped the tent. The beam of light cut through the darkness, illuminating the barren landscape. "Hello!" he called out. There was no response, just the whistling wind. "We have to check it out," he said, his voice firm. I hesitated, every instinct screaming at me to stay put. But the urgency in that voice was impossible to ignore. We followed the sound down the trail, the flashlight casting eerie shadows on the jagged rocks. The cries grew louder, more insistent, leading us deeper into the canyon. "Help!" The voice seemed to echo from every direction, bouncing off the canyon walls. "Where are you?" Lucas shouted, his voice cracking with frustration. Then the cries stopped. We stood there in the oppressive silence, the flashlight trembling in Lucas's hand. "I don't like this," I said, my voice barely above a whisper. Lucas nodded, his bravado fading. "Let's head back." As we turned to leave, a low growl rumbled through the darkness. It wasn't an animal sound, it was deeper, more guttural, like something ancient and unnatural. The flashlight flickered, casting erratic shadows on the rocks. And then we saw it. A figure emerged from the darkness, hunched and distorted, its limbs too long, its movements jerky and unnatural. Its eyes glowed faintly, reflecting the weak beam of the flashlight. Lucas froze, his breath hitching. "What the?" The figure moved closer, its form shifting, morphing between human and animal. One moment it resembled a gaunt man, the next a grotesque coyote-like creature. "Run!" I shouted, grabbing Lucas's arm. We sprinted up the trail, the sound of heavy, uneven footsteps pounding behind us. The creature let out a piercing shriek, a sound that seemed to burrow into my skull. Reaching the campsite, we didn't stop to grab our gear. We piled into the truck, Lucas fumbling with the keys. The engine roared to life and we sped off, the tires kicking up clouds of dust. In the rearview mirror, I saw the figure standing at the edge of the clearing, its glowing eyes watching us. We drove through the night, not stopping until we reached the safety of a motel miles away. Lucas never spoke about what we saw, and neither did I. But sometimes, when I'm alone at night, I hear faint cries for help carried on the wind, and I wonder if it's still out there, waiting for someone else to answer its call. The drive through the isolated desert highway was supposed to be just another late night trek for me and my dog, Max. My job as a long-haul trucker often took me through the vast, barren landscapes of the Southwest, but this particular stretch was different. Locals whispered about strange happenings around these parts, a place known for its isolation and the stories of shifting beings that roamed the land. I brushed it off as local folklore, though I kept Max close to me for company. His quiet presence was reassuring on lonely nights like these. The first sign of trouble came just past midnight. My rig was cruising smoothly when Max perked up, his ears twitching and his body stiffening. He let out a low growl, his gaze fixed on something outside the passenger window. "What is it, boy?" I asked, my voice steady despite the chill creeping down my spine. He didn't bark, just growled, a deep, guttural sound that sent shivers through me. I glanced at the road ahead, but it was empty, stretching endlessly under the pale moonlight. That's when I saw it, a shadow darting across the highway, too fast to be a human or an animal. My headlights barely caught it, but the shape was all wrong. It moved on two legs but hunched over like a beast. "Must have been a coyote," I muttered to myself, though I didn't believe it. A few miles later, the engine sputtered. The dashboard lit up with warning signals, and before I could react, the truck shuddered to a stop. "Great," I muttered, pulling over to the shoulder. I grabbed a flashlight and stepped out, Max trailing close behind me. The night was eerily quiet, the kind of silence that made your ears strain for any sound. I popped the hood and leaned in, shining the flashlight over the engine. Everything looked fine, no loose wires, no signs of overheating. And then I heard it. A voice, faint and distant, carried on the wind. "Help me!" I froze, my flashlight trembling in my hand. Max's growl deepened, his hackles raised. "Hello?" I called out, my voice echoing into the emptiness. The voice came again, closer this time. "Please, help!" Against my better judgment, I turned toward the sound, scanning the area with my flashlight. The beam caught a figure in the distance, barely visible against the dark desert backdrop. It was a woman, hunched over and limping toward me. "Are you okay?" I called out, stepping closer. Max barked sharply, pulling back on his leash. He rarely acted this way, and his behavior made my stomach twist. The woman didn't answer. As I got closer, I realized something was off. Her movements were jerky, almost mechanical, and her limbs seemed unnaturally long. "Hey, do you need help?" I tried again, my voice shaking. She stopped abruptly, her head snapping toward me. Her eyes reflected the flashlight beam, glowing faintly in the darkness. Max barked again, louder this time, yanking on his leash as if trying to pull me away. The woman, or whatever she was, let out a low, guttural sound, and before I could react, she dropped to all fours and started running toward me, impossibly fast. I stumbled back, nearly dropping the flashlight. "Max, run!" We bolted back to the truck, Max leaping into the cab just as I slammed the door shut. My hands fumbled with the keys, the engine sputtering to life after a few agonizing seconds. The headlights illuminated the figure, now standing at the edge of the road, its form shifting and writhing as if it couldn't decide what it wanted to be. I floored the gas pedal, the tires screeching as we sped down the highway. In the rearview mirror, I saw the figure give chase, its distorted shape keeping pace for far longer than anything humanly possible. When it finally disappeared into the distance, I let out a shaky breath, my hands gripping the wheel so tightly my knuckles turned white. We didn't stop until we reached a truck stop miles away. I parked under the bright lights and sat there, trembling, while Max licked my face, his way of calming me down. The next morning, a mechanic checked the truck, but found nothing wrong. The engine started perfectly as if nothing had happened. I never drove that stretch of highway again. But sometimes, late at night, I hear faint whispers on the wind, and Max growls softly in his sleep, as if remembering that horrifying encounter. The desert doesn't forget, and neither do I. It was a perfect October evening when my friends and I decided to take a detour through the Arizona desert. The sky was painted in shades of crimson as the sun dipped below the horizon, the full moon rising to take its place. We were on a cross-country road trip, seeking adventure and stories to tell. Little did we know the story we were about to live through would haunt us forever. There were 4 of us in total, my best friend, Carter, who was always chasing thrills, Alyssa, the skeptic of the group, Max, the quiet observer, and me, the one who somehow always got dragged into Carter's harebrained schemes. The plan was to take a shortcut through a lesser-known desert trail to shave off a few hours on our journey. The GPS called it the Red Moon Path. The name alone should have been enough to deter us, but Carter was insistent. "It's just a name," he said with a grin, his hand gripping the steering wheel of his beat-up SUV. "What's the worst that could happen?" The trail was rough, the road barely more than a dirt path winding through barren landscapes. Cacti and scrub bushes lined the way, their shadows stretching long and ominous in the moonlight. The further we drove, the quieter it became. Even the desert seemed to hold its breath. Alyssa, sitting in the back seat, crossed her arms and sighed. This feels like the setup to every horror story ever. Middle of nowhere, no cell service, and Carter leading the way. "Relax," Carter replied, his voice laced with amusement. "We'll be fine." But then the howling began. At first it was faint, almost indistinguishable from the wind. But as we pressed on, it grew louder, a mournful sound that sent shivers down my spine. It wasn't like any animal I'd ever heard before, Too deep to be a coyote, too wild to be human. "Did you hear that?" Max finally spoke, his voice low. "Probably just a wolf or something," Carter said, though his usual confidence faltered. "Wolves don't live in this part of the desert," Alyssa countered, her eyes darting nervously toward the window. As if on cue, the SUV's headlights caught movement up ahead. A shadow darted across the road, too fast to identify. Carter slammed on the brakes, the vehicle skidding to a halt. "What was that?" I asked, my heart pounding. "Something big," Carter muttered, his knuckles white against the wheel. We sat in silence, our breaths shallow, as the desert returned to its unnatural stillness. But then the howling came again, closer this time. It seemed to echo from all around us, as if the very land was alive with it. "We should turn back," Alyssa said, her voice trembling. "This doesn't feel right." Carter hesitated, but before he could respond, the SUV jolted violently. Something had struck it from behind, hard enough to make the whole vehicle shake. Luna, Carter's golden retriever, who had been napping in the cargo area, woke with a start and began barking furiously. "Everyone stay in the car," Carter shouted as he reached for a flashlight. But Max, against all better judgment, opened his door and stepped out. "We need to see what hit us," he reasoned, though his voice betrayed his fear. I wanted to stop him, but curiosity got the better of me. Grabbing my own flashlight, I followed Max. The desert air was cold, the kind that seeped into your bones, and the silence was deafening. We circled to the back of the SUV, our beams cutting through the darkness. There, on the dusty rear bumper, were deep claw marks, each one spanning nearly a foot. "What the hell could have done that?" Max whispered, his voice barely audible. Before I could respond, a guttural growl rumbled from the shadows. Slowly, we turned our flashlights toward the source. What we saw will forever be etched into my memory. A creature crouched low, its body long and sinewy, covered in mangy fur. Its limbs were grotesquely elongated, its hands ending in razor-sharp claws. But it was the eyes that paralyzed me, glowing an unnatural shade of red, filled with intelligence and malice. The creature bared its teeth, jagged and yellowed, and let out a roar that shook the air. Max and I bolted back to the SUV, slamming the doors shut behind us. "Go, go, go!" I yelled, my voice cracking with panic. Carter didn't need to be told twice. He floored the gas, the tires kicking up a cloud of dust as we sped down the trail. The creature gave chase, its movements unnervingly fluid, almost serpentine. Luna barked incessantly, her teeth bared as she growled at the back window. The SUV bounced and jolted over the uneven terrain, but no matter how fast we went, the creature kept pace. It was toying with us, staying just close enough to be seen, its red eyes glowing in the rearview mirror. "We're not going to outrun it!" Alyssa screamed, clutching the door handle as if it would save her. "We don't have a choice!" Carter shouted back, his knuckles white on the wheel. Then, without warning, the creature disappeared. One moment it was there, and the next it was gone, swallowed by the darkness. The absence of its presence was almost as terrifying as its pursuit. "What just happened?" Max asked, his voice shaky. "Maybe we lost it," I said, though I didn't believe it for a second. But as we rounded a bend, the SUV skidded to a halt. Blocking the road was the creature, now joined by two others, their eyes glowing like coals in the night. They stood motionless, their forms obscured by the swirling dust. "We're trapped," Alyssa whispered, tears streaming down her face. The creatures began to close in, their movements slow and deliberate. Luna growled fiercely, but it was no use. We were outmatched, and we all knew it. Then, just as the largest of the creatures leapt toward the SUV, a blinding light filled the sky. It was as if the moon itself had exploded, bathing the desert in an ethereal glow. The creatures howled in agony, their forms flickering like mirages before they vanished into the night. For a long moment, none of us spoke. The only sound was the hum of the engine and Luna's panting. Slowly, Carter eased the SUV forward, steering us back toward the main road. We never spoke of what happened that night, not to each other, and certainly not to anyone else. But sometimes when the moon is full and the night is too quiet, I see those red eyes in my dreams, watching, waiting. And I know the red moon path hasn't seen the last of its victims. The night air was heavy as we wound through the desolate highways of New Mexico, an endless expanse of desert stretching out under the pale light of a waxing moon. My girlfriend Dana was asleep in the passenger seat, her head resting against the window as the rhythmic hum of the car lulled her into a deep slumber. In the back seat sat our friend Eric, earbuds in, scrolling on his phone. It was supposed to be just another road trip adventure, a chance to escape the mundane and see the Southwest. We were heading toward a small canyon off the beaten path, a spot Eric had heard about on some obscure travel forum. According to the post, it was secluded, stunningly beautiful, and rarely visited, perfect for the kind of off-grid camping we were looking for. But the directions were vague, relying more on landmarks than road signs, and the deeper we went, the more I began to regret trusting some stranger's vague description of a canyon with a weird rock that looks like a face. The road grew narrower as we drove, the pavement giving way to dirt and gravel. Dana stirred awake as the car hit a bump, rubbing her eyes groggily. "Are we there yet?" she asked, her voice heavy with sleep. "Almost," Eric said, though his tone lacked conviction. He was studying the GPS on his phone, but the signal was spotty at best. "I hope this place is worth it," Dana muttered, glancing out the window at the barren landscape. A strange sense of unease had been creeping over me since we left the main highway. It wasn't just the isolation, though, that was part of it. It was something else, something I couldn't quite put my finger on, like we were being watched. I dismissed the thought as paranoia and pressed on. The trail ended abruptly at the edge of the canyon, and we stepped out of the car to take in the view. The canyon was breathtaking, its jagged walls illuminated by the moonlight, casting long, dark shadows that seemed to dance with the breeze. But the silence was oppressive. No wind, no animals, not even the faint rustle of leaves. It was as if the land itself was holding its breath. "Let's set up camp here," Eric suggested, already pulling the gear from the trunk. Dana and I exchanged uneasy glances but said nothing. The canyon was eerily quiet, but we'd come too far to turn back now. As we pitched our tent, I noticed something strange on the canyon wall opposite us. A shadow moved quick and deliberate, but there was nothing there to cast it. I blinked, and it was gone. "Did you see that?" I asked Dana, pointing across the canyon. "See what?" she replied, following my gaze. "I thought I saw something moving over there. It's probably just your eyes playing tricks on you," she said, though her voice carried a hint of doubt. We sat around a small campfire that night, the flames crackling softly as we tried to shake the growing sense of unease. Eric, ever the adventurer, was telling a story about an old legend tied to the area. "Locals call it the Watcher," he said, his face lit by the orange glow of the fire. "They say it's some kind of spirit that guards the canyon, punishing anyone who disrespects the land." "Great," Dana muttered. "Why didn't you tell us that before we came here?" "Relax," Eric said with a grin. "It's just a story." But as the night wore on, the shadows seemed to grow darker, deeper. The air felt heavier, the silence more oppressive. And then we heard it, a low, guttural growl that echoed through the canyon. We froze, our eyes darting toward the source of the sound. The firelight flickered as if something unseen had disturbed the air around it. "What was that?" Dana whispered, her voice trembling. "Probably an animal," Eric said, though his face betrayed his fear. The growl came again, closer this time. And then we saw it. A figure emerged from the shadows, its form barely distinguishable from the darkness. It was tall and impossibly thin, its limbs unnaturally elongated. Its face, or what passed for one, was featureless, save for two glowing eyes that burned like embers. We scrambled to our feet, backing away as the creature stepped closer. It moved with an unnatural grace, its body shifting in and out of the shadows as if it were part of them. "Get in the car!" I shouted, grabbing Dana's hand. We bolted toward the SUV, the creature closing the distance with terrifying speed. Eric tripped and fell, his phone flying from his hand as he hit the ground. I turned back to help him, but he waved me off, shouting, "Go! Just go!" Dana and I dove into the car, slamming the doors shut just as the creature reached Eric. I'll never forget the sound of his screams, a mix of terror and agony as the shadows swallowed him whole. I floored the gas pedal, the tires spinning in the dirt before catching traction. The creature didn't chase us. It didn't need to. It had gotten what it wanted. We didn't stop driving until we reached the nearest town, the sun rising behind us as we pulled into an old diner. We sat in silence, our hands shaking, our minds reeling. There was no way to explain what we had seen, no way to make sense of it. When we finally found the courage to return to the canyon weeks later, there was no sign of Eric. His phone was gone, the campfire ashes scattered by the wind. The only trace of our nightmare was a single claw mark etched into the canyon wall, a grim reminder of the Watcher's warning. I haven't been back to the desert since that night, and I don't plan to. But sometimes, when the shadows grow long and the wind is too quiet, I can feel it watching, waiting for its next visitor. The open road had always felt like freedom to me. Late, night drives were my escape, a chance to think, to let the hum of my car engine drown out the noise in my head. On that particular night, I was heading back home from a weekend camping trip in the Colorado Rockies. The solitude of the winding roads was comforting, and the thought of being back in my own bed kept me going, despite the creeping fatigue. It was just past midnight when I realized my fuel gauge was dangerously low. The needle was hovering just above empty, and the last sign I had passed promised a gas station in 10 miles. I eased off the accelerator to conserve fuel, my eyes darting between the road and the gauge. When I saw the small, weathered sign for the Hollow Creek Gas and Rest, I breathed a sigh of relief. The station was just off the main highway, a single building with a dimly lit canopy over the pumps. It looked like something out of a time capsule, frozen in the 1970s, with peeling paint and a flickering neon sign that read, "Open." I pulled up to the pump, got out, and swiped my card. The machine rejected it. Frowning, I tried again. Same result. Inside the building, I could see a lone figure standing behind the counter, a vague silhouette in the yellow glow of the interior lights. "Of course," I muttered, grabbing my wallet and heading inside. The man behind the counter was older, with a thin, weathered face and deep, set eyes. His name tag read, Earl. He didn't smile, didn't greet me, just stared as I approached. "Pump's card reader isn't working," I said, sliding a 20 across the counter. "Can I get some gas?" Earl nodded slowly, his gaze lingering on me longer than felt comfortable. Without a word, he rang up the sale and handed me the receipt. As I turned to leave, he spoke, his voice low and gravelly. Be careful out there." I paused, glancing back at him. "What do you mean?" He didn't answer. He just stared, his expression unreadable. Unease prickled at the back of my neck, but I shook it off. It was late, and I was tired. "People are weird," I told myself as I walked back to my car and started pumping gas. The sound of the fuel flowing into the tank was oddly soothing, a steady rhythm in the quiet night. But then I heard something else, a faint rustling, like leaves brushing against the pavement. I looked around, but the lot was empty. The road beyond was dark and still. "Just the wind," I whispered, trying to convince myself. But the rustling grew louder, closer. I stopped pumping and turned in a slow circle, scanning the shadows that seemed to press in from all sides. That's when I saw them, figures barely discernible in the gloom. They were crouched near the edge of the lot, their forms hunched and unnatural. My breath caught in my throat as one of them stood, its movement jerky, as though its joints didn't work quite right. It was tall, too tall, and its limbs were unnervingly thin. I dropped the nozzle and scrambled into the car, slamming the door shut and locking it. My hands shook as I fumbled with the keys, my heart hammering in my chest. The engine roared to life and I threw the car into gear, peeling out of the lot without a backward glance. The road stretched out before me, but the feeling of being watched didn't fade. In the rearview mirror, I caught a glimpse of the figures stepping onto the road, their movements more fluid now, almost graceful. They were following me. I pressed the accelerator, my car hurtling down the highway. The shadows seemed to melt into the darkness, but I knew they were still there. I could feel them. After what felt like hours, I saw the lights of a truck stop up ahead. It was larger than the gas station, brightly lit and bustling with activity. I pulled in, parking close to the entrance, and practically stumbled out of the car. The inside of the truck stop was a stark contrast to the oppressive night outside. It was loud and brightly lit, filled with the sounds of conversations and clinking dishes. I found a booth in the corner and ordered a coffee, my hands still trembling. "Long night?" the waitress asked, her voice kind. "You could say that," I muttered, taking a sip of the scalding coffee. When I finally felt calm enough to leave, the sun was starting to rise. The world felt safer in the daylight, and I convinced myself that the figures on the road had been a trick of my tired mind. But as I walked back to my car, I noticed something that made my blood run cold. Scratches, long, deep gouges ran down the sides of the vehicle, as though something with claws had tried to get in. I never stopped at another remote gas station again. Some roads are better left untraveled, and some warnings, no matter how cryptic, are meant to be heeded. I had always prided myself on my independence. Long drives at night, especially through remote areas, was something I enjoyed. They offered a sense of solitude and clarity, a break from the chaos of everyday life. This particular drive, however, would strip away that comfort and replace it with something far darker. It started as an impulsive decision. I had been visiting a friend in a small town several hours from home, and rather than stay the night, I decided to hit the road. The forecast was clear and the highway stretched ahead like a ribbon under the starry sky. After about 2 hours, my GPS rerouted me due to a supposed accident ahead. It led me off the main highway and onto a desolate 2-lane road that cut through dense woods. I wasn't thrilled, but I trusted the technology. The first hour on the back road was uneventful. My headlights illuminated the pavement and the encroaching trees on either side, casting long, shifting shadows. I played music to keep myself awake, occasionally glancing at the GPS to ensure I was still on course. Then out of nowhere, the car's low fuel warning chimed. My stomach sank as I glanced at the dashboard. I hadn't paid attention to the fuel gauge, assuming I'd hit another gas station on the highway. But on this lonely road, there wasn't a station in sight. A few minutes later, as if by some miracle, I saw a dim light flickering in the distance. As I got closer, the light revealed itself to be a small, worn-out gas station. The place looked like it hadn't been updated in decades, with a rusty sign swinging gently in the breeze. I pulled in, relieved to see the pumps were functional. But something about the place felt off. The air was unnaturally still, and the only sound was the faint hum of the neon sign buzzing overhead. I stepped out of the car and started filling the tank. The pump was old, requiring me to lift a lever before the gas flowed. As I stood there, a strange sensation washed over me, an awareness that I wasn't alone. I glanced around but saw no one. The station's office was dark, the windows dusty and opaque. The forest loomed in the distance, its shadows deeper than seemed natural. Just as I finished pumping, a voice broke the silence. "Traveling late, aren't you?" I spun around to see a man standing a few feet away. He seemed to have appeared out of nowhere. He was tall and thin, with a face that was oddly nondescript, like a sketch that hadn't been fully realized. "Yeah," I said, my voice steady despite the unease curling in my stomach. "Just passing through." He nodded slowly, his eyes fixed on mine in a way that felt invasive. "Be careful on these roads. Strange things happen out here." Before I could respond, he turned and walked toward the forest, disappearing into the trees without another word. I hurried back into my car, locking the doors out of instinct. The man's warning echoed in my mind, but I shook it off. People in remote areas could be eccentric, that was all. As I pulled back onto the road, the strangeness of the encounter lingered. The night felt darker, the air heavier. My headlights pierced the blackness, revealing nothing but the empty road ahead. It wasn't until I reached a crossroads that the true horror began. My GPS instructed me to take a right, but as I approached the turn, I saw a figure standing in the middle of the intersection. I slowed to a stop, squinting to make out the figure's details. It was the same man from the gas station, standing perfectly still, his face obscured by the shadows. Adrenaline surged through me as I threw the car into reverse, deciding to take the left turn instead. My tires screeched as I sped down the unfamiliar road, my heart pounding like a drum. The road twisted and turned, each curve revealing more darkness. And then I saw them, figures lining the roadside, their forms barely visible but unmistakably human. They didn't move, didn't acknowledge my car as it passed. They just stood there, watching. Panic clawed at me, but I forced myself to keep driving. I didn't know where I was going, I just knew I couldn't stop. The road seemed endless, an unbroken ribbon of asphalt that stretched into oblivion. After what felt like hours, I saw the faint glow of a larger highway in the distance. Relief flooded me as I sped toward it, the haunting figures fading into the rearview mirror. When I finally merged onto the highway, I pulled over at the first rest stop I found. My hands shook as I gripped the steering wheel, my breaths coming in shallow gasps. I never found out what those figures were or why that man had warned me. But I learned one thing that night: some roads aren't meant to be traveled, and some warnings should never be ignored. Driving through the Navajo Nation was something I had always wanted to do. The open skies, the vast desert, and the rugged beauty of the land seemed like the perfect setting for a road trip. This was a journey of discovery for me, a chance to connect with the land and its stories. I had been driving since early morning, and by the time dusk rolled around, I found myself in the middle of nowhere, surrounded by nothing but desert and distant mesas. The light was fading fast, casting long shadows across the landscape, and the air seemed to hold an unusual stillness. My car hummed steadily as I drove along the two-lane road, the only sound breaking the silence. The occasional road sign appeared, but they were few and far between. My GPS had no signal, and my phone's battery was critically low. Still, I pressed on, comforted by the idea that I was exploring uncharted territory, at least for me. About an hour after sunset, I saw a figure on the side of the road. It was a man, tall and thin, standing perfectly still. His clothes were nondescript, and he held what appeared to be a walking stick. Something about the way he stood, rigid and unmoving, made me uneasy. I slowed the car as I approached, unsure of whether to stop or keep driving. When I reached him, he turned his head sharply to look at me. His face was shadowed, but his eyes glinted in the headlights like those of a predator. A chill ran down my spine. My instincts screamed at me to keep driving, so I did. I glanced in the rearview mirror, expecting to see him fade into the darkness, but he was gone. The road ahead stretched on, seemingly endless. I began to feel a gnawing sense of unease, as if I were being watched. The desert around me was empty, yet the air felt charged with an unseen presence. Then, out of nowhere, a coyote darted across the road. I slammed on the brakes, my heart racing as the animal vanished into the night. The coyote's appearance seemed to punctuate the strange energy of the evening, as if it were a sign I didn't fully understand. A few miles later, my headlights illuminated another figure on the roadside. This time, it was a woman. She was crouched low, her long hair obscuring her face. Something about her posture was deeply unsettling, too animalistic, too wrong. I didn't slow down this time. As I sped past her, she snapped her head up, and for a fleeting moment I saw her face. Or rather, I saw something that shouldn't have been possible. Her features were distorted, almost like they were shifting, her mouth too wide, her eyes too large. I kept driving, my hands gripping the wheel so tightly my knuckles turned white. The road seemed to stretch on forever, a surreal ribbon winding through an oppressive night. I began to hear sounds, soft at first, like whispers carried on the wind. Then they grew louder, turning into guttural growls and strange, high-pitched cries. The noise seemed to come from everywhere and nowhere, enveloping the car in a cacophony of unnatural sounds. Panic set in as I realized I wasn't alone. Shadows flitted at the edges of my vision, darting in and out of the beam of my headlights. They moved too quickly to be human, but they were unmistakably humanoid in shape. I pushed the gas pedal to the floor, desperate to escape whatever was out there. The car roared down the road, the engine straining as the speedometer climbed. And then the road ended. My headlights illuminated a dirt trail that led off into the desert, and my heart sank. I hadn't seen any turn-offs or intersections, and the thought of retracing my route filled me with dread. With no other option, I followed the dirt path. The sounds outside grew louder, more frenzied, as if whatever was pursuing me knew I was venturing deeper into their domain. The trail led to a small clearing, and there, in the middle, stood a lone shack. Its wooden walls were weathered and splintered, and a single lantern hung from the porch, casting a dim, flickering light. I hesitated, my instincts screaming at me to turn around, but I knew I couldn't go back. The sounds were too close now, the shadows pressing in. I stepped out of the car, the desert air cold and biting. The ground beneath my feet felt wrong, too soft, too pliable. As I approached the shack, the door creaked open on its own. Inside, the air was heavy, suffocating. The room was empty except for a table in the center, on which lay an old, tattered book. Its cover was unmarked, and the pages were filled with strange symbols and drawings. I didn't want to touch it, but something compelled me to. The moment my fingers brushed the cover, a deafening howl pierced the night. It wasn't human, nor was it entirely animal. It was something else, something ancient and malevolent. The shadows outside began to coalesce, forming figures with glowing eyes and elongated limbs. They surrounded the shack, their growls vibrating through the walls. In a desperate act, I grabbed the book and ran back to the car. The figures followed, their movements unnaturally fast and fluid. I barely managed to slam the car door shut before they reached me. The engine roared to life, and I tore out of the clearing, the shadows chasing me down the dirt path. When I finally reached the paved road, the figures vanished. The oppressive weight in the air lifted, and the night was silent once more. I didn't stop driving until I reached the next town, where I collapsed in a motel room, clutching the book like a lifeline. To this day, I don't know what I encountered in that desert. But I do know one thing. The book's symbols still haunt my dreams, and the howl still echoes in my ears. It was supposed to be a routine drive across the American Southwest, a straight shot from Flagstaff to Albuquerque, where I was meeting a group of friends for a camping trip. I had always enjoyed the solitude of desert roads, the way they stretched endlessly under the vast, star-filled sky. But this trip would take me through Navajo land, a region steeped in legend and lore that I didn't fully understand. I had heard the stories, of course, whispers of shapeshifters, ancient curses, and malevolent spirits that roamed the arid expanse. My mother had warned me before I left. Do not stray from the main roads and do not stop for anyone, no matter what. I took her words to heart, but as the journey wore on, the monotony of the highway and the hypnotic glow of my headlights made it hard to stay vigilant. By the time I noticed my gas gauge dipping into the red, I realized I'd been driving for hours without seeing another car or a single gas station. The road was eerily quiet, with only the occasional coyote darting across the asphalt to break the silence. I finally spotted a small wooden sign that read, "Canyon Rest Stop, 2 miles." Relieved, I decided to take the exit. The road leading to the rest stop was a winding dirt path, the kind that seemed to weave deeper into nowhere. The air grew colder, and the moonlight illuminated the jagged cliffs that loomed on either side. The rest stop itself was little more than a decrepit shack with a single gas pump out front. I pulled in, my tires crunching on the gravel, and stepped out of the car. The air felt heavy, charged with something I couldn't quite identify. I grabbed the nozzle and began fueling up, glancing around nervously. There was no attendant, no sign of life at all. As the gas pumped, I heard a sound, a faint, melodic humming that seemed to drift on the wind. It was distant at first, almost like a lullaby, but it grew louder with each passing second. I turned to look and froze. Standing at the edge of the lot was a figure shrouded in shadow. It was tall, unnaturally so, and its silhouette was wrong. Its limbs were too long, its posture too rigid. "Do you need help?" I called out, my voice shaking. The figure didn't respond. Instead, it began to move, slowly, deliberately, toward me. Its movements were jerky, as if it were being controlled by invisible strings. Panic surged through me. I yanked the nozzle out of the tank and jumped back into the car, slamming the door shut. The figure was closer now, its features becoming clearer in the glow of my headlights. Its face was a grotesque mockery of a human visage with hollow eyes that seemed to pierce through me. I floored the gas pedal, the tires kicking up gravel as I sped away. My heart pounded as I glanced in the rearview mirror, expecting to see the figure fading into the darkness. But it wasn't there. Instead, I saw something worse. The road behind me was filled with shadowy shapes, dozens of them, moving in unison. Their glowing eyes shone like beacons in the night, and their howls echoed through the canyon. I pushed the car to its limits, the speedometer needle climbing higher and higher. The shadows followed, relentless and unyielding. They moved with an unnatural speed, their forms twisting and shifting as they closed the gap between us. I turned a sharp corner and nearly lost control, the car skidding on the loose dirt. That's when I saw it. A massive arch carved into the canyon wall, illuminated by the moonlight. It looked ancient, its surface etched with symbols that pulsed faintly with an otherworldly light. Something told me that if I could reach the arch, I might be safe. The car roared down the narrow path, the shadows closing in. The howls grew deafening, a cacophony of rage and despair that made my skin crawl. Just as one of the shadows lunged for the car, I crossed under the arch. The moment I passed through, everything went silent. The shadows stopped at the threshold, their forms flickering like dying flames. They let out one final mournful howl before retreating into the darkness. I didn't stop driving until I reached the next town, where I pulled into a motel and collapsed in the lobby, shaking and incoherent. The staff must have seen the terror in my eyes because they didn't ask any questions. That night, I couldn't sleep. Every time I closed my eyes, I saw the shadows, heard their howls, and felt the oppressive weight of their presence. The next morning, I spoke to a local Navajo elder about what I had experienced. He listened carefully, his expression grave. "You crossed into cursed land," he said finally. "The arch you saw was a gateway, a barrier, keeping them from escaping. You were lucky to make it out alive." His words sent a chill through me. I left the town that afternoon, vowing never to set foot in the canyon again. To this day, I still hear the howls in my dreams, and I can't shake the feeling that something followed me out of that cursed place. Something that waits, just beyond the edges of the light, for the right moment to strike. The drive home from my cousin's wedding was meant to be peaceful. The ceremony had been lovely, the laughter of family filling the air like the music of a bygone time. I had stayed later than intended, caught up in the joy of the evening, and now the clock on my dashboard blinked 11:47 p.m. The road stretched out ahead of me, dark and winding as it cut through the desolate hills. It was a shortcut, or so I'd been told. A lonely stretch of asphalt that avoided the towns and their endless rows of stoplights. But something about this road felt off. The trees that lined its edges seemed too tall, their branches clawing at the starless sky. The air itself was unnervingly still, as if the world had paused its rotation just for this moment. Halfway into the drive, the gas gauge caught my attention. I cursed under my breath. I'd meant to fill up at the last station, but had been distracted by my phone buzzing with texts. The needle hovered just above empty, and my phone, now dead, lay useless in the passenger seat. I scanned the road for signs of life, my anxiety growing with each passing mile. Finally, a dim light flickered in the distance. A gas station, its neon sign sputtering weakly against the darkness. The words, "Last Stop," blinked on and off, casting strange shadows across the cracked pavement. I pulled in and parked beside the pump. The station was old, its windows fogged with grime and its roof sagging under the weight of age. An attendant emerged from the shadows, startling me. "Need a fill-up?" he asked, his voice gravelly. "Yes, please," I replied, trying to mask my unease. As he worked, I noticed something strange. A ridge loomed behind the station, its silhouette jagged and unnatural. It seemed out of place, like a piece of another world had been dropped here by mistake. "That's the Ridge of Shadows," the attendant said, following my gaze. "Locals don't go near it after dark." "Why not?" I asked, my curiosity outweighing my better judgment. He hesitated, then leaned closer. "Things move up there, things that shouldn't." Before I could ask him to elaborate, a distant howl cut through the night. It wasn't a coyote or any animal I'd ever heard before. The sound was guttural, raw, and filled with a malice that made my skin crawl. "You should leave," the attendant said, his tone urgent. "Now!" I didn't need to be told twice. I paid him, got back in my car, and sped off, my heart racing. The road curved sharply as it ascended the ridge, the dark landscape stretching out below. I tried to focus on the drive, but something in the rearview mirror caught my eye. A shape, large and indistinct, moved along the edge of the road. It was keeping pace with my car, its movements fluid and deliberate. I pressed the accelerator, the engine roaring as I climbed higher. The shape disappeared, only to reappear moments later, closer this time. My breath hitched as I realized it wasn't alone. More shapes emerged from the darkness, their glowing eyes fixed on me. The road narrowed as it wound its way along the ridge, the drop, off on either side, plunging into blackness. My hands gripped the wheel, sweat slicking my palms as I navigated the treacherous path. The shapes began to close in, their forms becoming clearer. They were humanoid, but wrong. Grotesque parodies of people with elongated limbs and faces that seemed to twist and ripple like shadows caught in the wind. One of them darted in front of the car, forcing me to swerve. The tires skidded on the loose gravel, and for a terrifying moment I thought I would go over the edge. I managed to regain control and pressed on, my pulse pounding in my ears. The ridge seemed endless, each turn revealing more of the creatures as they stalked me. Then I saw it, a tunnel carved into the rock, its entrance framed by ancient symbols that glowed faintly in the moonlight. The creatures hesitated, their movements faltering as if the tunnel held some power over them. Without thinking, I veered into the tunnel, the car's headlights cutting through the darkness. The walls were lined with carvings, their intricate patterns telling a story I couldn't comprehend. The creatures didn't follow. Their howls echoed behind me, fading as I emerged on the other side of the ridge. The road flattened out, and the oppressive weight that had clung to me lifted. I drove until I reached the safety of the next town, where I pulled into a diner and collapsed into a booth, shaking. A waitress approached, concern etched on her face. "You look like you've seen a ghost," she said. "Ghost?" "Worse," I muttered. I told her what had happened, and she listened intently. When I finished, she nodded solemnly. "You're lucky to be alive," she said. "The Ridge of Shadows isn't just a place, it's a threshold. Most who cross it never come back." Her words stayed with me long after I left the diner. To this day, I avoid that stretch of road, but I can't escape the memories. I hear their howls in the quiet moments, see their glowing eyes in the corners of my dreams. And sometimes, when the night is still, I wonder if they're still out there, waiting for me to stray too close to the ridge once more. The sky was a swirling canvas of orange and purple as I drove through the arid desert landscape, the sun dipping low on the horizon. The road ahead stretched endlessly, flanked by jagged rock formations and sparse vegetation. I had been driving for hours, the rhythmic hum of the tires on asphalt my only company. This was supposed to be a road trip to clear my mind, a chance to escape the chaos of my life for a while. But as the evening descended, an unshakable sense of unease began to creep in. It wasn't the isolation that bothered me. I had always enjoyed solitude. No, this was something else, a heaviness in the air that I couldn't quite explain. The sun disappeared completely, leaving the world bathed in the cold glow of moonlight. I glanced at the GPS on my phone. It was frozen. Typical. The signal had been spotty for miles, and now it was gone entirely. The next town was still over an hour away, and my gas gauge was teetering dangerously close to empty. Just as I began to consider turning back, I spotted a sign ahead. It was old and weathered, its paint chipped and faded, but I could make out the words, "Trading Post, 5 miles ahead." Relief washed over me. A trading post meant civilization, even if it was just a small one. I pressed on, the headlights cutting through the darkness. When I arrived, the trading post looked like something out of a postcard from the 1950s. A wooden structure with a slanted roof, it was illuminated by a single flickering bulb above the entrance. A rusted gas pump stood off to the side, its hose coiled like a sleeping snake. I parked and stepped out, the desert air cool against my skin. The door creaked as I pushed it open, and a small bell jingled to announce my arrival. Inside, the place was cramped but cozy, shelves lined with dusty trinkets and jars of preserves. An old man stood behind the counter, his wrinkled face partially obscured by a wide, brimmed hat. "Evening," he greeted, his voice raspy. "Hi," I replied, trying to sound casual. "I was wondering if I could fill up my tank. I'm running low, and my GPS isn't working." The man nodded slowly. "Pump's still good. Pay inside after." As I turned to leave, he called out, "You headed up the old road past the canyon?" "I think so," I said. "Why?" His expression darkened. "Best stay clear of it after dark. Strange things happen out there." "What kind of strange things?" I asked, my curiosity piqued. He hesitated, as if weighing whether or not to tell me. "Skinwalkers," he said finally, his voice barely above a whisper. "Shape shifters. They prey on travelers who don't know better." I laughed nervously. "Sounds like something out of a ghost story." The man didn't smile. "Call it what you want. Just be careful." I left the trading post unsettled, but determined not to let his warning get to me. Superstitions, I told myself. Nothing more. The gas pump sputtered and groaned as I filled the tank, the sound echoing in the stillness. As I replaced the nozzle, I caught movement out of the corner of my eye. A coyote stood on the edge of the lot, its eyes glowing in the dim light. It didn't move, didn't blink, just stared at me with an intensity that made my chest tighten. I got back in the car and drove off, the coyote vanishing into the shadows behind me. The road wound through the canyon, its curves sharp and unforgiving. The darkness seemed to thicken, the moonlight struggling to penetrate the towering rock walls. That's when I saw it. A figure stood in the middle of the road, illuminated by my headlights. At first, I thought it was a person, a man, maybe. But as I got closer, I realized something was wrong. Its limbs were too long, its posture hunched and unnatural. I slammed on the brakes, the car skidding to a stop, mere feet from the figure. My heart pounded as it turned to face me. Its eyes were the same as the coyote's. The creature let out a guttural growl, a sound that seemed to vibrate through my very bones. Then, in one horrifying moment, it shifted. Its body twisted and contorted, the sound of cracking bones filling the air as it transformed into a monstrous wolf-like creature. Panic took over. I threw the car into reverse, the tires screeching as I backed away. The creature lunged, its claws scraping against the hood of the car. I floored the accelerator, the car lurching forward as I swerved around the creature. It gave chase, its monstrous form bounding alongside the vehicle. My mind raced as I tried to remember the old man's words. Skinwalkers, shape shifters. But how did you stop them? The creature suddenly veered off, disappearing into the darkness. I didn't dare slow down, my eyes darting between the road and the mirrors. Then the car sputtered. No, 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 I muttered, glancing at the gas gauge. Full. The engine shouldn't have been failing. The car rolled to a stop, the headlights flickering before going out entirely. Silence enveloped me, broken only by the sound of my ragged breathing. I fumbled with the keys, trying to restart the engine, but it was no use. A soft tapping came from the driver's side window. I turned slowly, my heart sinking as I saw a familiar face staring back at me, my own. The figure outside smiled, its eyes glowing just like the coyote's. It raised a hand, its fingers elongating into sharp claws. I locked the doors and scrambled into the back seat, clutching my phone, even though I knew it was useless. The figure began to circle the car, its form shifting and changing with each step. A coyote, a wolf, a human, each shape more grotesque than the last. Desperation took hold. I closed my eyes and began to pray, my voice trembling. The tapping stopped. When I opened my eyes, the figure was gone. I didn't waste any time. I climbed back into the driver's seat, and as if by some miracle, the engine roared to life. I sped out of the canyon, not daring to look back until I reached the safety of a well-lit highway. To this day, I don't know what I encountered that night. But one thing is certain. The old man's warning was more than just a ghost story. And I'll never drive through the desert after dark again. The trip had started as a simple detour. I was headed to visit my sister in Albuquerque, and the scenic route through the mesas was supposed to save me a couple of hours. It wasn't my first time driving through Navajo Nation territory, but I'd always stuck to daylight hours. This time, work had delayed my departure, and I found myself cruising through the open desert well after dark. The night was unusually quiet. No wind, no animal sounds, just the hum of my car's engine and the occasional crunch of gravel beneath the tires. It was peaceful, almost meditative, until I noticed the feeling. It was subtle at first, a prickling sensation on the back of my neck. The kind you get when someone's watching you. I shrugged it off, convincing myself it was just the isolation playing tricks on me. But then the unease started to grow. The road stretched on, illuminated by the pale glow of my headlights. To the left, a vast expanse of desert. To the right, towering rock formations that cast jagged shadows under the crescent moon. That's when I saw it. At first, it was just a movement in the periphery of my vision, a fleeting shadow against the rocks. I slowed the car, squinting into the darkness. Nothing. The landscape was empty, as it should have been. Shaking my head, I pressed on, trying to ignore the way my pulse had quickened. But the shadows didn't stop. Every few minutes, I'd catch something, an indistinct figure darting between the rocks just outside the reach of my headlights. The sensation of being watched was now impossible to ignore. Get a grip, I muttered to myself, gripping the steering wheel tighter. Ahead, the road curved sharply around a massive mesa. As I approached the bend, a figure stepped onto the road. I slammed on the brakes, the car screeching to a halt. The figure stood motionless, illuminated in the glare of my headlights. It was a man, or at least it looked like one. His frame was tall and gaunt, his clothes tattered and covered in dust. His face was obscured by shadows, but his eyes glowed faintly, reflecting the light like an animal's. I honked the horn, my heart hammering in my chest. "Hey! Get out of the road!" The figure didn't move. I was about to reverse when he raised a hand, pointing directly at me. It wasn't a gesture of greeting or warning. It felt accusatory, as though he were singling me out for some unseen transgression. The headlights flickered, plunging the road into darkness for a split second. When they came back on, the figure was gone. My breath hitched. I scanned the area frantically, but there was no sign of him, just the empty road and the looming mesa. I floored the gas pedal, eager to put as much distance as possible between myself and whatever I had just seen. The road climbed higher, the terrain growing more rugged. My headlights illuminated a scattering of animal bones along the roadside, too many to be natural. The prickling sensation returned, stronger than ever. A howl echoed through the night, long and mournful. It wasn't a coyote or a wolf. I knew those sounds well. This was something else, something that didn't belong. The car suddenly jolted as though I'd hit something, though the road ahead was clear. I stopped, my hands shaking as I gripped the wheel. "Don't get out," I whispered to myself. But curiosity got the better of me. Grabbing a flashlight from the glove compartment, I stepped out of the car, the desert air cold against my skin. I shone the beam around, expecting to see a coyote or maybe a deer. Instead, I found claw marks etched into the asphalt, deep and jagged, as if something massive had raked the road. The howl came again, this time closer. I whipped the flashlight toward the sound, my heart racing. The beam caught a pair of glowing eyes, low to the ground. The creature stepped into the light, a twisted, unnatural thing that defied explanation. Its body was vaguely canine, but its proportions were all wrong. Its legs were too long, its head too large, its movements too fluid. It growled, a guttural sound that made my blood run cold. I stumbled back into the car, slamming the door shut and locking it. The creature circled the vehicle, its claws clicking against the asphalt. The car wouldn't start. The engine sputtered uselessly as the creature pressed its snout against the window, fogging the glass with its breath. I did the only thing I could think of. I hit the horn. The loud, sudden noise startled the creature, and it backed away, its glowing eyes narrowing. Seizing the moment, I tried the ignition again. This time, the engine roared to life. I didn't look back as I sped away, the creature's silhouette fading into the rearview mirror. But the terror wasn't over. A mile down the road, I saw them, figures standing in the distance, illuminated by the moonlight. Dozens of them, their outlines barely human. As I approached, they vanished, melting into the shadows like smoke. I didn't stop again until I reached the outskirts of a small town, my hands still trembling as I pulled into the first gas station I saw. The attendant, a middle-aged woman with weathered skin, took one look at me and said, "You went through the mesa, didn't you?" I nodded, too shaken to speak. She sighed, shaking her head. "You're lucky to be alive. Not everyone makes it out." I wanted to ask her what she meant, but I already knew the answer. The mesas were more than just rock formations. They were home to something ancient, something that didn't take kindly to trespassers. And I had narrowly escaped its wrath. The drive home from my uncle's cabin was supposed to be uneventful, a 3-hour stretch of winding roads through dense forest and desert scrubland. I'd spent the weekend hunting with him, a long-standing tradition that brought us together every year. The trip was usually filled with laughter, hearty meals cooked over an open flame, and stories that felt more like folklore than truth. This year, though, things had felt different. My uncle had been quieter than usual, his eyes constantly scanning the tree line, as if expecting something or someone to appear. "Watch yourself on the way home," he said, as I packed my truck. "And don't stop for anything. Not a flat, not an animal, not even someone in trouble." I laughed, thinking he was joking. "What do you think is out there, Uncle Joe? Skinwalkers?" He didn't laugh. "Just listen to me. Keep driving." That was the first time I felt the shadow of unease creep in. By the time I left, the sun had dipped below the horizon and the world was cloaked in twilight. The first hour of the drive was uneventful, the rhythmic hum of the tires against the pavement almost lulling me to sleep. Then I saw it. A deer stood in the middle of the road, its eyes reflecting the glow of my headlights. I slowed down, expecting it to bolt into the woods. But it didn't move. Instead, it stared at me, unblinking, as I rolled to a stop. The longer I looked at it, the stranger it seemed. Its body was too thin, its fur patchy and uneven. Its legs looked elongated, almost human-like. And then it smiled. I froze, my breath catching in my throat. Animals don't smile, not like that. It wasn't a look of friendliness or curiosity. It was a grin of malice, teeth bared in a way that was unnervingly human. Instinct took over, and I slammed the gas pedal. The deer, or whatever it was, darted out of the way with unnatural speed, disappearing into the shadows of the forest. My heart pounded as I drove on, the road stretching endlessly ahead. I couldn't shake the image of that thing's smile. About 20 minutes later, I saw it again. This time, it wasn't a deer. It was a coyote, sitting calmly at the edge of the road. But something was wrong. Its head was tilted at an unnatural angle, and its eyes glowed faintly, even without the headlights directly on it. I didn't stop. As I passed, the coyote turned its head to follow me, its movements jerky and mechanical. My stomach churned as I glanced in the rearview mirror, half expecting it to be chasing me. But the road was empty. I gripped the steering wheel tighter, my uncle's warning echoing in my mind. Don't stop for anything. The forest began to thin out, giving way to stretches of open desert. I told myself I was overreacting, that my imagination was running wild. Then the truck sputtered. "No, no, no," I muttered, glancing at the fuel gauge. It wasn't empty, but the engine was struggling, coughing like it was choking on air. I coasted to the side of the road, my hands trembling. Stepping out into the cool desert air, I popped the hood and grabbed a flashlight. The engine didn't show any obvious issues, but my knowledge of cars was limited. The silence was oppressive. Not a single cricket, not a breath of wind, just the distant hum of the cooling engine and my own shaky breaths. That's when I heard it, a faint rustling sound, like footsteps on gravel. I whipped the flashlight around, the beam cutting through the darkness. At first, I saw nothing. Just the empty road and the vast expanse of desert beyond. But then in the distance I spotted a figure. It was a man, or at least it looked like one. He was walking toward me, his movements slow and deliberate. "Need some help?" I called out, trying to mask the fear in my voice. The figure didn't respond. As he drew closer, the flashlight revealed more details. His clothes were torn and dusty, his skin pale and stretched tightly over his bones. But it was his eyes that froze me in place. They were empty. Not just figuratively, there were no pupils, no whites, just black voids staring back at me. I stumbled backward, dropping the flashlight. The beam spun wildly as it hit the ground, casting long, flickering shadows. When I looked up, the figure was gone. The rustling sound grew louder, circling me like a predator stalking its prey. I scrambled back into the truck, slamming the door shut and locking it. The engine roared to life on the first try. I didn't question it. I floored the gas, the tires kicking up gravel as I sped back onto the road. But the terror wasn't over. In the rear-view mirror, I saw them. Not just one figure, but dozens, all standing in the road behind me. Their forms were indistinct, shifting and blending with the shadows. They didn't chase me. They didn't need to. The feeling of being watched stayed with me the entire way home, long after the figures had disappeared from sight. When I finally pulled into my driveway, I sat in the truck for a long time, too afraid to step out into the open air. The next day, I called my uncle and told him what had happened. He listened in silence before saying, "I told you not to stop. Whatever you saw out there, it wasn't human. They're drawn to fear, to hesitation. You got lucky. I don't take the scenic route anymore." The trip was supposed to be a quick getaway, a weekend of camping and fishing in a remote canyon a few hours from the city. My friend Jake and I had been planning it for weeks, looking forward to the kind of isolation you can only find far away from cell service and city noise. We packed light, a couple of tents, some basic gear, and enough food to last us through Sunday. The canyon was known for its crystal clear river and dramatic rock formations, a place where the sky stretched endlessly, unbroken by power lines or buildings. The first day was perfect. The sun warmed the canyon walls as we set up camp by the river. We spent hours fishing, laughing, and telling stories by the fire as the night settled around us. The stars were so bright it felt like you could pluck them from the sky. But as the fire died down, a peculiar unease crept over me. It started with the sounds. At first, it was subtle, a rustling in the bushes, the crunch of gravel that didn't match our movements. I dismissed it as the wind or maybe a stray animal. Jake seemed unfazed, so I pushed the thoughts aside. But then came the whispers. They were faint, almost inaudible, like voices carried on the breeze. At first, I thought it was Jake, but when I glanced at him, he was sitting silently, staring into the fire. "Did you hear that?" I asked, breaking the quiet. "Hear what?" Jake replied, his brow furrowing. "The voices." He laughed, shaking his head. "You're just spooking yourself. It's probably the wind echoing off the canyon walls." I nodded, but the explanation didn't sit right. The whispers weren't random, they sounded deliberate, like fragmented words spoken just out of reach. That night, I barely slept. Every time I closed my eyes, the whispers seemed to grow louder, weaving in and out of my thoughts. The next morning, I told myself I was imagining things. Daylight brought a sense of normalcy, and we spent the day exploring the canyon. By the time the sun dipped below the horizon, I had almost convinced myself it was all in my head. But the second night was worse. The whispers returned, clearer now, and there was a new sound. Footsteps. They circled the campsite, crunching on the gravel just beyond the firelight. Jake heard it too this time, his face pale as he gripped a flashlight. "Probably coyotes," he muttered, but there was no conviction in his voice. We scanned the darkness, the beam of the flashlight slicing through the shadows. Nothing. "I think we should pack up and leave," I said, my voice trembling. Jake hesitated. "It's probably nothing. Let's just wait until morning." Reluctantly, I agreed, but my gut told me we weren't alone. As the night stretched on, the footsteps grew bolder, coming closer to the tents. The whispers turned into low murmurs, like a crowd of people speaking in hushed tones. Then, just as suddenly as it started, the noise stopped. For a moment, the silence was deafening. Then came a sound that made my blood run cold, a deep, guttural growl, followed by a sharp, metallic screech, like nails dragging across rock. Jake and I bolted from the tents, adrenaline surging. "What the hell was that?" he whispered, his eyes wide with terror. We grabbed our flashlights and scanned the area. The fire had burned down to embers, casting eerie shadows across the rocks. That's when we saw it. A figure stood at the edge of the light, its form distorted and wrong. Its limbs were too long, its movements jerky and unnatural. Its face, or what I assumed was its face, was featureless, a blank canvas of pale skin. The thing tilted its head as if observing us before taking a step closer. "Run!" I shouted, grabbing Jake by the arm. We didn't stop to grab our gear. We sprinted through the canyon, the creature's footsteps echoing behind us. The whispers returned, louder now, overlapping into a cacophony of voices. Somehow we made it back to the truck. Jake fumbled with the keys, his hands shaking as the whispers grew louder, almost drowning out our panicked breaths. The engine roared to life, and we tore out of the canyon, the tires kicking up dust and gravel. We didn't stop until we reached the nearest gas station miles away. As we sat in the truck, trying to catch our breath, Jake broke the silence. "What do you think that was?" he asked, his voice barely above a whisper. I shook my head. "I don't know, but I'm never going back there." We returned the next day with a group of friends to retrieve our gear. The campsite was untouched, as if we'd never been there. But the area felt wrong. The air was heavy, the silence oppressive. None of us spoke as we packed up and left, a shared understanding that some places are better left alone. To this day, I can still hear the whispers when I close my eyes. It was my third year as a park ranger, and Elk Ridge National Forest had become more than just my workplace. It was my sanctuary. The sprawling wilderness, with its towering pines and rugged terrain, offered a peace I couldn't find anywhere else. But one summer evening, that peace was shattered in a way I'll never forget. It started with a call from a frantic camper. A group of 4 had reported seeing something strange near their site, a tall, thin figure lurking in the shadows. I dismissed it at first, attributing it to overactive imaginations or maybe even a bear. But protocol required me to investigate, so I grabbed my flashlight, a radio, and my trusty dog, Rocky, and headed out. The sun was setting as I arrived at the campsite. The campers were visibly shaken, their stories consistent despite the fear in their voices. They described a creature standing on 2 legs with unnaturally long arms and glowing yellow eyes. It had watched them silently from the tree line before retreating into the darkness. "Probably just a bear," I reassured them, though their accounts left a gnawing doubt in my mind. Rocky and I ventured into the woods, following the trail where the campers claimed to have seen the figure. The forest was unnaturally quiet, no rustling leaves, no distant calls of owls or crickets, just an oppressive silence that seemed to press against my ears. Rocky, usually fearless, was on edge. His ears were perked, and his nose twitched as he sniffed the air. Suddenly he stopped and let out a low growl, his hackles rising. "What is it, boy?" I whispered, shining the flashlight ahead. That's when I saw it. A pair of glowing yellow eyes stared back at me from the darkness. They were too high off the ground to belong to any known animal in the area. I froze, gripping the flashlight tighter as the figure stepped closer, its form becoming clearer. It was humanoid, but grotesque, with skin stretched tightly over its elongated frame. Its limbs were impossibly thin, and its movements were jerky, like a marionette controlled by an inexperienced puppeteer. It didn't make a sound as it approached, its unblinking eyes locked onto mine. I backed away slowly, my heart pounding. Rocky growled louder, his body tense and ready to lunge, but something about the creature's gaze kept me rooted in place, as if it was daring me to run. And then it spoke. The voice was wrong, too deep, too distorted, and layered with an echo that sent chills down my spine. "Why are you here?" I couldn't answer. My mouth was dry, my thoughts a jumbled mess of fear and confusion. "Leave," it said, the word reverberating through the trees. That was all the encouragement I needed. I turned and bolted, Rocky by my side, his barks echoing in the silence. I didn't stop until I reached the campsite, where I ordered the campers to pack up and leave immediately. They didn't argue, their fear matching my own. As we drove out of the forest, I radioed my supervisor and reported the incident. He listened silently before responding. "You're not the first ranger to see it." That statement haunted me. Over the next few days, I dove into the history of Elk Ridge, piecing together accounts from previous rangers and locals. The stories were eerily similar: sightings of a tall, humanoid figure, strange whispers in the woods, and an overwhelming sense of dread. Some called it a skinwalker, a creature from Native American folklore capable of taking on human or animal forms. Others believed it was something older, something that had lived in the forest long before humans ever set foot there. I never saw the creature again, but the memory of that encounter lingers. I still patrol the forest, though I never venture into that part of Elk Ridge alone. Some nights, when the wind is still, I swear I can feel eyes watching me from the shadows, and I wonder if it's still there, waiting for someone foolish enough to return. The remote town of Red Creek sat nestled in the foothills of the Rocky Mountains, surrounded by dense forest and an air of timeless mystery. People rarely moved there, and even fewer left. I had heard the rumors growing up, tales of strange occurrences in the woods, unexplained disappearances, and whispered warnings about the things that stalked the night. Still, when my friend Nate suggested a weekend camping trip to Red Creek, I reluctantly agreed. "We'll just be a few miles outside the town," Nate said. "Fresh air, stargazing, and maybe even some fishing. You'll love it." It was supposed to be a break from the grind of city life, an escape into nature. But from the moment we arrived, something felt off. The air in the forest was heavy, almost oppressive, and the usual sounds of birds or insects were absent. As we set up our tents near a quiet stream, I couldn't shake the feeling that we were being watched. Nate, ever the optimist, laughed it off. "City life has made you paranoid," he joked, slapping me on the back. That first night, I woke to the sound of whispering. At first, I thought it was Nate, but as I sat up and strained to listen, I realized the voices were coming from outside the tent. Low and guttural, the whispers seemed to weave in and out of the wind, impossible to pin down. "Nate!" I hissed, shaking him awake. "What's up?" he mumbled, groggy and annoyed. "Listen," I whispered. He sat up, his expression shifting from irritation to confusion as he heard it too. "What the hell is that?" We grabbed our flashlights and cautiously stepped out into the cool night. The whispers stopped immediately, replaced by an eerie stillness. The forest around us seemed alive with an unnatural tension, and the beam of my flashlight felt feeble against the encroaching darkness. "Weird," Nate muttered, visibly unnerved. Probably just the wind. But I wasn't so sure. The whispers had sounded deliberate, almost conversational. We returned to our tent, but sleep was impossible. I lay there, staring at the nylon ceiling, my mind racing. The next day, Nate suggested we explore the area, hoping to shake off the unease from the night before. We followed the stream deeper into the forest, marveling at the towering pines and the dappled sunlight filtering through the canopy. For a while, it felt like a normal camping trip. But as we ventured farther, we stumbled upon something that brought back the dread from the previous night. In a small clearing, we found a circle of stones, each one etched with strange, intricate symbols. In the center was a pile of bones. Animal, I hoped, though their size and shape left me unsure. The air around the clearing was cold, unnaturally so, and the oppressive silence returned. "Let's head back," I said, my voice shaking. Nate, ever curious, crouched to inspect the stones. "These markings, they're old," he said, tracing a finger over one of the symbols. As he did, a sudden gust of wind tore through the clearing, carrying with it the unmistakable sound of whispering. It was louder this time, more insistent. Nate and I bolted, crashing through the underbrush until we reached our campsite. That night, the whispers returned, but they were different, louder, closer, and this time they called my name. "Jake!" they hissed, drawn out and dripping with malice. "Jake!" Nate heard them too, his face pale and eyes wide with terror. "We're leaving," he said, grabbing his bag. But as we packed, the whispers grew louder, almost deafening. The shadows outside our tent seemed to move, shifting unnaturally. And then we saw it, a figure standing just beyond the firelight. It was tall and gaunt, with glowing yellow eyes and a face that was both human and animal, as if it couldn't decide which to be. "Run," Nate whispered. We didn't need to be told twice. We abandoned our gear and sprinted through the forest, the figure following just out of sight. The whispers were everywhere now, echoing from every direction. My legs burned and my chest heaved, but I didn't dare stop. Somehow, we made it back to the car. We didn't look back as we sped down the dirt road, the headlights cutting through the darkness. The whispers faded as we left the forest, but the terror stayed with us. When we reached the safety of town, we reported what we had seen to the local authorities. They listened with grim faces, but offered no explanation. "Stay away from the woods," one officer said, his tone leaving no room for argument. Nate and I never returned to Red Creek. The forest still haunts my dreams, its whispers echoing in my mind. I don't know what we encountered that weekend, but one thing is certain: there's something in those woods that doesn't want to be found, and it's watching, waiting for its next visitors, for its next... The decision to take the scenic route was Nate's idea. We were on our way back from a road trip through the southwest, tired of interstates and craving the kind of views only remote landscapes could provide. The winding desert highway took us through rugged terrain and past towering mesas that seemed untouched by time. It was breathtaking in its desolation, but as night approached, the isolation became unsettling. "Let's find a place to stop," Nate said, squinting at the horizon. We spotted a rundown gas station a few miles down the road, its neon sign flickering weakly against the encroaching dusk. The place looked like it hadn't been updated since the 70s, but we were low on gas and options. Inside, the station was dimly lit and smelled faintly of oil and decay. An old man sat behind the counter, his weathered face partially obscured by the brim of his hat. He didn't look up as we entered, his gnarled hands busy with what appeared to be an old hunting knife. "Filling up?" he asked, without glancing up. "Yeah," Nate replied. "Is there a place to camp nearby? We're looking to stay off the road for the night." The man finally looked at us, his eyes sharp despite his age. "Not much round here except the old mesa," he said, nodding toward the window. "But if you've got sense, you'll keep driving." "Why's that?" I asked, trying to keep my tone casual.
"Strange things happen up there," he muttered, returning his attention to the knife. "People don't come back the same, if they come back at all." Nate and I exchanged a look. It was clear he thought the old man was just trying to scare us, but something in his voice made my skin crawl. "Thanks for the warning," Nate said, paying for the gas. As we drove away, the mesa loomed in the distance, its shadow stretching across the desert floor.
Against my better judgment, I agreed when Nate suggested camping there. "It's just a story," he said, grinning. "Besides, it'll make for an unforgettable view in the morning." We found a dirt trail that led part way up the mesa and set up camp near a cluster of jagged rocks. The sun had dipped below the horizon and the stars began to emerge, brighter and more numerous than I'd ever seen. For a while, the beauty of the night sky distracted me from the unease I couldn't quite shake. But as the hours passed, that unease grew. The wind picked up, carrying with it a sound I couldn't place, low and rhythmic, almost like chanting. At first, I thought it was my imagination, but when I looked over at Nate, his expression confirmed he heard it too. "What is that?" I whispered. He shook his head, scanning the darkness with his flashlight. The beam caught movement, a figure standing atop a nearby ridge, silhouetted against the starlit sky. It was too far away to make out any details, but the figure's posture was unnervingly still. "Hello?" Nate called, his voice steady despite the tension in his shoulders. The figure didn't respond. Instead, it began to move, not walking, but gliding down the slope toward us. Panic set in and we scrambled to pack up our gear, but the figure moved too quickly. By the time we had our packs on, it was standing just beyond the reach of our firelight. It was unlike anything I'd ever seen. Its body was human in shape, but its limbs were too long, its movements too fluid. Its face was obscured by shadow, but I could feel its gaze boring into me. And then it spoke, not in words, but in a guttural sound that vibrated through my chest. Nate grabbed my arm. "We need to go now." We bolted down the trail, the creature's inhuman wail echoing behind us. The darkness seemed to close in, the stars offering little comfort, as we stumbled over rocks and loose dirt. The truck came into view, and for a brief moment I thought we might actually make it. But as we reached the vehicle, the air around us grew thick, heavy with an oppressive energy that made it hard to breathe. The chanting returned, louder now, and the creature appeared again, blocking the path to the truck. Desperation took over. Nate grabbed a rock and hurled it at the creature, yelling for me to get in the truck. I didn't need to be told twice. As I fumbled with the keys, I heard Nate scream, a sound I'll never forget. The engine roared to life and I slammed the door just as Nate dove into the passenger seat. His arm was bleeding, a deep gash running from his shoulder to his wrist. "Drive!" he shouted. I floored it, the tires kicking up dirt as we sped down the road. The creature didn't follow, but the chanting stayed with us, fading only when we were miles away. We didn't stop until we reached a motel in the next town. Nate's wound required stitches, but he refused to go to a hospital, insisting we keep moving. "It's still out there," he said, his voice hollow. To this day, I don't know what we encountered on that mesa. I've read about skinwalkers, spirits, and curses tied to sacred land, but none of the explanations feel sufficient. All I know is that the desert holds secrets best left undiscovered, and some warnings should never be ignored. trip to Navajo Ridge wasn't supposed to be anything extraordinary. It was a detour from our usual hiking routes, a quiet spot untouched by tourist traps. My best friend Gavin had suggested it, claiming the ridge offered the kind of views that made you forget the rest of the world existed. The idea of solitude was appealing. My life had been a chaotic mess lately, and I was desperate for some clarity. We arrived just as the sun was setting, the sky ablaze with streaks of orange and crimson. The ridge stretched out like a spine, jagged and uneven, with dense forests on either side. It was stunning, but there was something about the place that felt wrong. I chalked it up to the lack of cell service and the eerie silence. No birds, no insects, just the sound of the wind weaving through the trees. "Man, this place is perfect," Gavin said, setting down his pack. "No one around for miles." "That's what bothers me," I muttered, scanning the tree line. "Feels like we're being watched." Gavin laughed, brushing off my unease. "You've been watching too many horror movies. Relax. It's just us and nature." We set up camp near the edge of the ridge, where the forest opened up to a breathtaking view of the valley below. Gavin started a fire while I unpacked our gear. As the flames crackled and the darkness deepened, I couldn't shake the feeling that something was off. Shadows danced around us, cast by the flickering firelight, but one shadow seemed different. It didn't move like the others. "Do you see that?" I asked, pointing toward the trees. Gavin squinted, then shrugged. "It's just the firelight. Chill out." But it wasn't. The shadow grew, stretching unnaturally tall before retreating into the forest. My heart raced, but I didn't say anything. I didn't want Gavin to think I was losing it. As the night wore on, the temperature dropped and the fire began to wane. Gavin went to gather more wood while I stayed behind, clutching a flashlight and trying to ignore the oppressive silence. Minutes passed, then an hour. Gavin didn't return. I called out, my voice echoing into the void. There was no response, just the rustling of leaves in the distance. Grabbing my flashlight, I ventured into the forest, my heart pounding with every step. "Gavin!" I shouted, my voice trembling. The beam of light cut through the darkness, revealing twisted roots and gnarled branches that seemed to reach for me. And then I saw it, a figure standing motionless in the shadows. It wasn't Gavin. Its body was humanoid, but its limbs were grotesquely elongated, its eyes glowing faintly in the dim light. I froze, paralyzed by fear. The figure tilted its head, studying me, and then it spoke, or rather, it mimicked. "Gavin?" it repeated, in a voice that was almost, but not quite, human. I stumbled back, tripping over a root and landing hard on the ground. The figure stepped closer, its movements unnervingly fluid. My instincts screamed at me to run, but my body refused to cooperate. Suddenly, Gavin burst through the trees, his face pale and his breathing ragged. "Run!" he yelled, grabbing my arm and pulling me to my feet. We sprinted back to the campsite, but when we got there, the fire was out and our gear was gone. It was as if we had never been there. Gavin didn't stop, dragging me toward the trail that led back to the car. "What happened?" I gasped, struggling to keep up. "I don't know," he said, his voice shaking. "I was getting wood, and I saw it. It wasn't human, but it looked like me." We reached the car and locked the doors, our hands trembling as we fumbled with the keys. The engine roared to life, and we sped down the dirt road, leaving the ridge behind. But as we drove, I couldn't shake the feeling that we weren't alone. In the rearview mirror, I saw a figure standing at the edge of the forest, its glowing eyes following us until the ridge disappeared from view. We didn't talk about what happened that night. Gavin stopped hiking altogether, and I've avoided anything remotely resembling the wilderness since. Whatever we encountered on Navajo Ridge wasn't natural, and I'm certain it was watching us long before we ever realized it. Some places aren't meant to be explored, and some things are better left in the dark.